Hi everyone, and welcome to the first lecture for APG5456 Understanding Media Audiences. So if you haven't already, I ask that you go back and watch the welcome and orientation video, which will give you a better sense of what this unit is about overall, and will introduce you to the key assessments and kind of give you an outline of those dimensions of the unit. In this video, I'm going to give you a brief introduction and a background to the history of studying media audiences. As I said in the orientation lecture video, we are most interested in contemporary audiences and contemporary media audiences and debates. So we will fast forward next week to the more kind of current moment in audiences, but I do think it's worth spending a little bit of time reviewing some of the major trends and developments in studies of audiences. So some first principles. Lots of people want to know about audiences. That includes media producers who want to know things like, are people watching my shows, right? Are they consuming the content that we're producing? But also, do they like it? And maybe do they share it with their friends? What sorts of people are watching this media content? In related fields, in things like advertising, marketing, PR, you might want to research audiences because you say, well, what media content are our target audiences consuming most, in order that we can think about where we want to place our messages, our ads, and so on. Where should they place their ads or their campaigns so that they reach the right kinds of audiences where they are consuming media already. But also governments care deeply about audience research. A whole range of government departments and associated institutions, organizations, and services, they want to know things like, are people being informed about relevant issues and services? How can these departments, these government branches, can they use media to influence people? So that includes things like health campaigns or other kinds of public information campaigns. Or maybe they want to know about audiences in order to be able to provide better services for them. And of course, there are a range of regulators which sit more broadly across government and elsewhere who say things like, how are people's uses of media changing, and how does that impact on both the media industries but also related industries and other industries and even other social functions? They need to know what audiences are doing as well, and so on. You can immediately see with these sorts of questions and these concerns, right, that the answer to any of those is likely to be quite complicated. It is not sufficient just to say, measure the size of an audience, right? And that's the kind of thing that you might do relatively easily with measurements like ratings, or even looking at back-end analytics on a social media kind of platform, or clicks on a website, and so on, right? We can get those measurements relatively easily these days, but you need to know more than just the size of the audience. You need to know about the types of media they are engaging with, but also things like, what do they do with it? How do they feel about it? What is the role of it in their lives more generally? In short, you need to understand media audiences. So when it comes to this question of understanding media audiences, there are a series of major methodologies for studying media audiences in order to do this, to understand them deeply. And these are the major methods within the discipline of media communications and also cultural studies as well. These include things like, first and foremostly, surveys and interviews, right? They're very different, but they're kind of seeking to do the same thing, which is to analyze and to gather information about people's own thoughts and responses to questions, things like attitudes, opinions, feelings about media. An interview obviously speaks one-on-one with somebody, whereas a survey will be questions which respondents answer remotely, right? So not in front of somebody else. A focus group is another approach which involves trying to understand the attitudes, opinions, beliefs, and feelings of a people within a set group, right? And so that's usually conducted in an interview style, but with a group of people who belong to a group that you want to study and understand. There are ethnographies, also anthropologies, which are about observed behaviours. So we're not going to ask you necessarily what you do, we're going to watch what you do. We're going to try and observe what you do with media. There are also oral histories. That one you might be less familiar with. This involves kind of talking to people and getting their personal recollections of the past, of past behaviours maybe, or past attitudes. And then there are a range of kind of more complicated digital methods. And this is kind of like a catch-all term to describe a range of different methods that extract digital data or information and analyze it to do things like map social networks and patterns of behavior amongst online users. There are also a range of what I would call non-disciplinary approaches to studying audiences. And weirdly, you might be more familiar with these. So I'll kind of talk about this in a little bit more detail when we go into the history of audience studies, but so much audience research is actually based not in media and communications, but in psychological and particularly kind of behavioral studies, right? And so those approaches do things like they measure bodily responses, right? So sweat or heart rate, they might do case studies of individuals. They might do kind of experimental behavioral studies, psychological studies of individuals about what they do with media and how it affects them. And then there's also kind of market and more consumer behavior research, which is a little bit of a mix of these approaches, which will combine more psychological, kind of really behavioral oriented research, things like psychological studies, experimental kind of behavioral studies and so on, alongside more traditional media and communications approaches like surveys or focus groups. Now you can see there I've got a little avoid using this literature. I just want to make a point here to say that so much audience research that you might encounter, that you might already be familiar with, is actually, it belongs to these schools. It belongs to market research, but also moreover behavioral research, behavioral studies. And you are not a psychologist and I am not a psychologist. So actually we are not really equipped to undertake that sort of research or even really to assess articles about that research, right? So I just kind of want to flag that when you're doing your research, when you're kind of doing some background studies, I want you to pay attention to this distinction, right, between the disciplines. So we are in a School of Media, Film and Journalism. You are studying a Masters of Media and Communications, or maybe you're studying a Masters of Journalism and so on. But it sits broadly within this field of media and communications and also cultural studies. That's the discipline. And that's the kind of that's the boundaries through which we are going to approach audience research. You will encounter other kinds of audience research, but be very mindful that you are not qualified, nor indeed am I qualified to undertake or really to evaluate those sorts of more psychological and behavioral approaches to audience studies. So most early audience research fits into traditions which sit outside or in a way predate media and communications and cultural studies as a discipline, and they are more often located within behavioral sciences and kind of psychological studies of individuals. These studies are sometimes grouped together and described as media effects traditions or behavioralist traditions as well. These forms of early audience research, they are conducted throughout the 1920s into the 1960s. You can see these are the dominant ways that we approach audiences. They linger on into the 1970s, and they're really driven by social fears. So social fears about audiences, social fears about media. And some of these fears are more legitimate and some kind of less so. So at the time that a lot of this early research is undertaken, the world's really responding to the rise of fascism and the effects and impacts of things like the First and Second World Wars. So there's real concern at this time about the ability of kind of fascist leaders in Europe. This is the time of Hitler and Mussolini, who are making great use of new media, in particular radio, to kind of in a way radicalize and affect the minds and behaviors of citizens. So there was this real fear about the capacity of these new forms of media, most especially radio, but to an extent film and later television. So real concern about how these might be used to kind of radicalize citizens and to encourage them to take on like extreme behaviors. But there are also these kind of ongoing concerns, and you see these still today, right? So there's a real concern about new media, and at different points this new media will change. At this point it's comics and comic books and also movies, and the effects that they might have on children. So a real panic about juvenile delinquency, but also kind of sexualization of children, so children being exposed to concepts that are maybe violent or criminal or otherwise kind of explicit and adult kind of themes too early. So real concern about what effect is this going to have on our children. And, you know, related to that, there's this kind of wider concern about the relationship between media content and crime, criminal behavior, and violence. So the most early studies from within this media effects tradition are often identified as the Pain Fund studies, which ran from the 1920s through until the 1930s. You might have heard of these. These are kind of fairly famous, well-known studies of media audiences. So at the time that these were conducted, there was already a pre-existing moral panic about the increase in numbers of movie theatres and the number of, a sense, kind of unaccompanied minors, so young children who were attending this new form of entertainment. And so the questions that this research set out to address were shaped already by these pre-existing concerns. And they were: what sort of ideas do children get from the movies? How deeply are they affected emotionally? How many children are going and how often? Do the movies inspire criminal and delinquent tendencies? Do they affect children's sleep or nerves? So you can kind of see straight away that the questions that they are coming to the study with are already shaped by these pre-existing concerns. So the studies that they used involved a range of different approaches from this more psychological behavioural studies approach. They included questionnaires, but also psychological interviews, and also emotional stimulation was measured using laboratory techniques. So things like skin responses, sweating, heart rate, and that sort of stuff. Their findings, as you can see there on the quote, is that the ultra-realistic nature of film and film colour, right? So the verisimilitude of movies is, they say, irresistible. So it's an irresistible presentation of reality, which will prove irresistible to young children, resulting in, so the resultant effects being immediate effects on a child's character, right, and development. So the effects of this irresistible realism would be juvenile delinquency. And these findings would later contribute quite directly to this subsequent introduction of the Hays Code, which is a kind of self-censorship mode that Hollywood then operated under to kind of try and to address the concerns here. What these studies did not contribute to, and this is important, they didn't contribute to things like social services for young children, to education, to resources for those children, their parents, their schools, or indeed kind of addressing the question of why it was there were so many kind of unaccompanied young children able to spend so much time in the movies in the first place. So straight away there's this problem emerges, which is that it becomes a relatively easy solution to this supposed problem is to censor the media rather than kind of look at any of the root problems that might have played a role in this scenario. And there are so many other famous studies in this tradition which you may have encountered already. So there's Albert Bandura's Bobo doll study, so named after a toy doll, a so-called Bobo doll, in which a girl would hit a toy after watching kind of similar imagery. So, you know, a kind of monkey see, monkey do, the child sees something and the child just copies whatever they see on screen. There was the US Surgeon General's 1972 study, so really again informed at the time by a massive kind of moral panic about the relationship between media and violence, and in particular children and media and violence. And it identified a direct causal relation which exists between viewing violence and exhibiting aggressive behaviour. But a caveat there, they say it's only for some children who are already predisposed to be violent, okay? And then you might also have heard of cultivation theory, so George Gerbner's theory, and that is more of a sense in which there's no kind of single smoking gun, right? There's no single violent media text that makes people violent, but the overall accumulation of violence in media does make people violent, or it desensitizes them to violence. And there are lots of other studies in this tradition. And what they share in common is the perception that an external source, right, that is mass media, was kind of, in a sense, infecting young people. And most of these studies propose very direct causal effects from things like reading crime comics, superhero comics, watching television shows, watching violent movies, and later you would see the same kinds of conversations about violent video games. These concerns are totally ongoing, right? So as I said, you'll see these same conversations play out when it comes to video games still, and violent video games, but also kind of more generally, there is this real panic, real anxiety at times about the relationship between consuming too much media and that radicalizing, making people more violent. You see this really especially with regards to children, sex, and violence. But there are some serious criticisms of this behaviouralist tradition of audience research into media effects. So buckle up, there's a few problems to go through. Firstly, these tend to be the most well-known of audience research studies, even though many of them are quite old. They have a very enduring appeal. They also are quite simplistic explanations. So the reason I say they're simplistic is because they involve kind of linear or causational understandings of media and communications, in which there is a sender, a message, and a receiver. You might also encounter this in the form of magic bullet or hypodermic needle theories. They very much fit within this linear and causational understanding of how media and communication work. So part of the reason they are enduring is because they provide simple explanations for complicated social phenomena. They provide also simple solutions, which is simply to regulate or to censor media content. So they provide simple solutions for what seem like complicated or sticky social problems. Everyone wants a nice simple solution, right? They're also popular theories because they're easy to understand, right? So lay people can kind of go, oh yeah, media effects, media make you do something, right? It's easy to wrap your head around. But they are vague. So terms like aggression, violence, delinquency are really socially constructed terms often, and what your understanding of delinquency and mine will vary, and understandings of these terms will also vary across time, right? So queer content might be considered to kind of be delinquent content in the 1920s and 30s and through until the 1970s, and now we wouldn't think like that. Same, you might think of kind of talking back to an adult as not being violent or aggressive, or even delinquent, but it might have fit under these categories in an earlier historical period. There's also this big question, which is, if it's so, if it works in these ways, why isn't everyone affected equally? How do you kind of account for differences? So why are these scientists who are conducting these studies not affected? Why aren't the film and screen censors who have to watch oceans and oceans of violent content in order to kind of censor material, why aren't they affected? And this is one of those questions that I always put to students who are interested in media effects topics, which is like, if, you know, who is the exception? If you are not affected, then why and how can you assume others are affected by media in these ways? How do you account for distinctions? And that's where you'll see a kind of often a focus on the vulnerable or the at risk, like children. So these are the people who are most likely to be affected. And also they seem to be fixated on negative effects. So much of the study is about negative effects. Why would we not kind of see, radical improvements in other dimensions, which are about the kind of positive dimensions or the positive representations of media? Can we not see or measure those equally too? Why is it only that negative effects are A, most studied, and B, most observed? And finally, and most importantly, viewing media is social and it's contextual. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. So correlations have indeed been found between things like heavy media consumption and other factors that might impact crime rates. So heavy media consumption, there are correlations between that and things like poverty or neighborhoods that are affected a lot by crime, or education levels or employment rates, even levels of air pollution. But that is correlational, right? Not causational. So observing that people who did violent or criminal things also like violent media is very, very different to saying that violent media makes people do violent things. All right. So part of the problem of this is that it assumes, in a sense, that kind of audiences are these empty vessels, and it doesn't pay attention to the social and the cultural dimensions of media and how media is consumed. Hence, on this exact topic, on researching media effects, Jane Stokes, in the reading this week, she argues that the media are often blamed for social ills to the detriment of identifying the real causes of the problem. In the past, politicians in the USA and the UK have found it more convenient to blame various sectors of the media for social ills than their own policies and actions. So she says it's easier to pass a law banning the representation of, say, violence than it is to prevent violent conduct. It's much easier to just ban or outlaw media. The real causes of violence in society, such as family instability, mental illness, poverty, and so on, these are much harder to solve. And so she says the idea that media might play a role in making people behave badly has been well researched, right? So I've just shown you there's about 70 years of it. But there is no substantive evidence at all to support it. She says many experienced scholars have attempted to study media effects and found very little hard evidence. So in this long period from the 1920s to the 1970s, although there is a focus and kind of high profile attention on the issue of media effects, particularly regarding media, children and violence, or media, children and sex, there is in fact a lot of other research going on at this time, but for those reasons I mentioned, it's less well recognized, it's not as popular or as widely understood and shared as some of the media effects traditions. Most likely because they come to much more complicated and nuanced conclusions which aren't so easy to talk about, and they don't present necessarily easy solutions. So in the next few slides, I just want to introduce you to this other history of audience research, some of the interesting ideas and observations that other researchers working outside of media effects and more in this kind of tradition that we recognize in media and communications and cultural studies. So one of these is Paul Lazarsfeld, who studied kind of radio audiences and the listening habits of Americans. And he found in a study of women and radio listening that they listened to radio soap operas for so many different reasons, right? And so he observed that radio soap operas or radio dramas, they help pass the time, while women are otherwise doing pretty kind of drudgery, boring housework, right? They're not in work, they're not in study, they're just at home doing boring stuff. Maybe they've got little children. And these shows, these radio programs, help them just pass the time. They also provide, he says, parasocial relationships. So you kind of build, as those who watch soap operas might know, you build this kind of, imaginary relationships. You have these feelings towards these characters, which is really kind of satisfying. And so he says they also help these women who are stuck at home. Maybe they're living quite remotely or regionally. They're cut off from a lot of other stuff. These soap operas help them learn about the world. They provide role models. Importantly, they offer an emotional release, right? So you get kind of catharsis from a sad storyline or a really happy storyline or a really romantic storyline. They're really satisfying to emotionally engage in that sort of content. And also finally that he says, yes, the effects, that he can observe effects on audience behavior, but it's just one small part of how people make meaning from media. So we have to pay attention to all these other things. Later, Katz and Bulmer's research introduces this idea that you might have encountered before of uses and gratifications. So this represents a pivot towards thinking about audiences much more actively. And in this research, they argue that people should not study what media do to people, but rather what people do with the media. There's also Russell Middleton's work from the 1960s in which he kind of revisited some of the general ideas about pain fund studies and in particular concerns about propaganda, looking at kind of anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic content in a film. And he says, look, no single film seems to have any kind of lasting impact in terms of its message, right? So even though it might have a really horrible message, it doesn't have any kind of longer lasting effect on the audiences that he studied. And he said, in fact, audiences, if they encounter a message like that, they often avoid it, they just don't pay attention to it, or they trivialize it, like, yeah, that's just part of the movie. They dismiss it as just entertainment, right? I don't take it seriously, it's just a movie. And so he says, he introduces this concept which becomes very important in later audience studies, which is that audiences resist the intended meaning. You might want to communicate a specific message, maybe you do, but there's no guarantee that there is a linear relationship or a causational relationship. Audiences might see your message, recognize your message, and reject it or resist it. So in the 1970s, during another significant period of kind of moral panic about media content, particularly about kind of explicit or adult themes, sexualization of children and violence, so these are the real recurring concerns that people have about media, there were these two studies. So Charles Winnick's study, in which he conducted a survey of 100 or so porn consumers, and he said, look, there's no correlation between hardcore porn consumption and sexual offending. So this idea that the more porn you watch, the more likely you will be a deviant or kind of develop, sexual offending patterns, he says there's no correlation. And in fact, that porn is used for these things that seem kind of common sense to us now, right? For pleasure, for information, for education, for fun, for arousal. So there's a range of different reasons why people use porn. It doesn't make them deviants. And then there was Richard Dembo's 1973 study in which he did a kind of ethnographic or observational study of British teenage boys and the relationship between their media use and aggression. And he said, boys enjoy violent images in comic books, in TV, in movies, because they are exciting, right? And that excitement lets them escape routine worries and life stress. They're not doing it to learn how to be criminals or because it makes them into criminals, because it serves these other kind of cathartic, emotional and social functions. And this brings us up really to the late 1970s, when there start to be much more nuanced models of communication and media flows, and more complex and nuanced audience research. And so there at the top I've got Stuart Hall's encoding-decoding model, which you might have encountered before. And so this proposes a totally non-linear model of communication in which there are something more like a circuit of communication, so flows of communication. And also in that headline there, encoding and decoding, you can see that he starts to talk about the ways in which audiences are also responsible and kind of active, and they have agency in what they do with the media messages that they receive. And so he proposes that audience can accept the intended message, but they might also negotiate, take on parts of a message or communication and reject others, or they might outright resist or reject the messages that they receive. So audiences have agency, they have the ability to decode, to negotiate what they take on from the media that they consume. Later on there, I've got Ian Ang's survey. So it kind of wasn't really a survey so much as Ang invited fans of the American TV show Dallas to write to her about why they watched the show, right? And so Ang was a fan of the TV show. She herself identified with the people that she was researching, so that's a really important shift in this sort of studies. I am like you, I like this stuff too. Tell me about why you like it and why you watch it. So she positioned herself as not separate to audiences, but part of the audience. And she really focused on what people got out of this TV show. So it's a trashy kind of American soap opera. And she says she really focuses on the range of different reasons, the range of different pleasures that people get out of watching so-called lowbrow or trash TV. And often she finds they know that is these things, they know it's supposedly trashy or it's lowbrow, but they nonetheless derive a whole bunch of other pleasures and functions from it. And in that sense, Ang really kind of reproduces studies that we saw, let's go back, in Paul Lazafeld's study. And he was looking at radio audiences and soap operas and found very similar things, right? Parasocial relations, emotional release. There's lots of reasons why people consume so-called kind of trashy content like soap operas. So in summary, audience research is often motivated by pre-existing social fears about the media. This is something I want you to keep in mind as we move through this course and as you do your own audience research. Think about the extent to which you might be bringing your own kind of prejudgments or pre-existing concerns about media to the research that you do. Just keep that in mind. Because it's motivated by these pre-existing social fears, often vested interests have played a role in the history of audience research. So that includes things like political interests, especially when it comes to concerns about moral panics, concerns about crime and violence and children and drug use and sexualization and all of those things, which get politicians and newspapers a lot of attention. But equally, industry has played a role here. So industry is often very vested in disproving media effects as well. The most well-known audience research is the most simplistic and the most frightening. That's why it gets the most attention. That's why they're the most well-known, but they're the least reliable and the hardest to carry out in terms of research. So the reality is usually much more complex, and there has been increasing recognition of this complexity since the 1970s especially, and that's something we'll pick up on next week in topic 2 when we look at the active audience. But I hope I've given you some examples of non-traditional or non-media effects research, so you get a sense in which this counter history of audience studies has been going on, kind of disproving media effects and looking at the complexities of audiences for a long time now. So for all those reasons, for the whole premise of this lecture is to kind of try and guide you away from trying to do media effects research for your assessment. If you're saying, I want to look at video games and violence and so on, I'm going to say be very cautious about that. Think about other ways you might approach doing that sort of research. All right. But as I will do in each lecture, I want us to kind of know what the whole point of this lecture was about. I want to be able to show you how you can relate some of these ideas, some of these concepts to the research that you're going to be doing this semester, to your own assessments. So moving beyond media effects, here are some of the other prompts that I would consider you to reflect on, to ask yourself when analysing your audience data. So you might like to think about this question. Do you identify as a member of the audience that you want to study? So are you a fan, like Ian Ang and Dallas? Can you find examples in which an audience accepts, rejects, or ignores the content of the media? What emotions, and that is positive or negative, what attitudes and emotions do audiences express when talking about the media? How do they feel? See if you can find language which reveals these things: attitudes, feelings, emotions. And following on from that, what pleasures do audiences describe? What do they enjoy about the media? But also, what do they dislike about it? And this really important one, which is about context. How does this media consumption fit into their everyday lives? And so this is where I will ask you to pay attention to things like where media is consumed, on the tram, on a train, in their living room, in their bedroom, how, when, with whom, and so on. So how does it fit into their everyday lives? All right, thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you in tutorials.